A pale nightlight pooled across wallpaper, tracing the small mattress where a baby should have slept. A soft blanket lay half-tucked, a single tiny sock forgotten on the floor, as if someone had paused to turn toward a whisper and never returned. The air still held the faint scent of baby lotion and summer air. Outside, the night had kept its ordinary sounds, a distant dog, the hush of a passing car, while inside a room that should have been the safest place in the world had been emptied of the most fragile presence it contained. When the house finally woke, the discovery moved with the slow, disbelieving cadence of grief. Hands that had only hours before smoothed sheets found only linen and a hollow shape where a child had been. Time in that moment fractured. Seconds stretched into an unbearable tautness, and ordinary movements became urgent and clumsy as everyone tried to assemble what could not be assembled. The last memory, the last breath, the last small noise. The quiet that follows a disappearance is different from sleep. It is heavy, expectant, a silence that seems to be holding its breath for an answer that does not come. There were small things that did not fit, details like pieces of a puzzle pushed askew. A window left ajar that did not belong to the night, a household object missing that now meant more than convenience ever could. None of these things explained the heart-rending absence of a life that had begun only months before, but they multiplied the questions until the home felt foreign to itself, a place where normal had been interrupted and could not be retraced. Neighbors would remember the weight of the morning, the way the news spread like spilled ink across a quiet street. The police would arrive with notebooks and flashlights, but the first hours of a missing child are a raw, chaotic theater where hope and horror stand shoulder to shoulder. The family's faces in those first light-filled moments carried a vocabulary of shock, disbelief, accusation, pleading, and an animal panic that moved through them with no script and no mercy. Everyone reached for something to hold on to, a blanket, a memory, a name, while the possibility that a child had simply been taken from the ordinary world refused to settle into comprehension. Who would step into a house at night and take a sleeping child? Who would cross a threshold lined with lullabies and leave no trace but an empty place at the center of a family? The questions arrive like shadows, and they do not leave with the day.
He was a small constellation of details, blue eyes that tracked a hand as if trying to catch every motion, hair so fine it lay like sun-bleached thread against his brow, a face that, in its unguarded openness, gave the world permission to be soft. In the hours when the house moved between wakefulness and sleep, he made tiny claims on the day, a fist that found a finger and refused to let go, a quick laugh that arrived like a bell and surprised the room, a limb that flailed with the stubborn energy of someone already practicing to stand. He was not yet a list of milestones, but the promise of them, a presence that rearranged ordinary moments into something like ceremony. Mornings in that house settled around him. The kitchen light would come on for a bottle while a parent padded about, careful in the small dark to avoid waking the other children. A bath was a ritual of steam and lavender-scented soap. A wet towel turned into a cape, a squeaking rubber toy scored by teeth and time. The nursery held the traces of constant attention, a mobile that wound down and started again, a faded stuffed animal with a missing eye, a stack of board books with soft corners softened further by repeated thumbings. There were tiny socks, a soft drool on a shoulder, the smell of warm milk and detergent, and the faint, clean scent that seems to belong only to very young skin. His family was a shifting constellation too, not fractured utterly, but rearranging itself. There was the careful choreography of parents learning to move close again, The father, returning one night, tentative in his steps, his hands learning the right pressure to cradle a body that would not complain. The mother carried the memory of nights alone and the constant, small vigilance that comes from keeping a child through uncertainty. Tiredness sat in the corners of her eyes, but when she watched Christopher, she softened in a way that made the rest of the house feel steadier. Siblings folded him into their own stories with the casual ferocity of children who claim a younger brother as if he confirmed their place in the world. A shoulder to climb on, a puppet show staged at the foot of his crib, a solemn, earnest kiss pressed to a forehead. There were domestic habits that read like affection. One Saturday morning, where a sibling insisted on showing him the way sunlight tumbled across the floorboards, a father who made a game of counting toes and then pretended to miscount so everyone laughed, the mother tracing a tiny palm with the tip of her finger as if mapping the future she hoped for. Even the smallest objects acquired weight. The rattle with a faint crack where it had been dropped, the blanket that smelled of both laundry and the person who habitually folded it, the car seat that had become the first small confine for the adventures of a day. These things were not set dressing. They were how love took form in minutes and gestures, how a household kept score of the life it tended. To watch him was to be aware of a world arranged around possibility. He angled his head at new sounds as if auditioning them for meaning. He reached for faces the way explorers reach for familiar landmarks. He had not learned to walk, but he practiced by launching himself from a lap into the arms of whoever smiled wide enough to catch him. There was an impatience to his delight, an urgency in the way he demanded attention that made every ordinary hour feel precious. Family photographs show him captured mid-grin, a finger in his mouth, a gaze that obeys no camera but the person who made the sound he recognized. Those images would later become relics, small evidence of a life that felt enormous in its capacity to gather love. Being his parents meant translating fatigue into patience and uncertainty into small, practical plans. There were conversations conducted half-formed between diaper changes and late-night feedings, tentative promises about birthdays and first steps, arguments softened by the sight of him asleep and trusting. The work of parenthood, soothing a fevered brow, learning the exact cadence of a cry, inventing a new song when the old ones no longer soothed, happened in half-lit hours and in the kitchen while cereal steamed. Siblings learned routines too. Who could get a pacifier with the gentlest hand? Who would be trusted to hold him for a minute while the dishes were stacked? In these tiny assignments, the family taught one another how to be steady, how to be responsible for something whose emotions were raw and immediate. He existed among ordinary hopes. There were plans that were never fully formed, a first birthday, the small regattas of everyday achievement that parents imagine and rehearse in half-whispered tones. There were also small private certainties, nicknames whispered in the dark, a favorite lullaby hummed off-key, the way a particular light in the living room made his hair look almost the color of evening wheat. These private textures made the house an intimate map. You could have navigated by them the way a sailor knows a shoreline by its small coves. How do you measure the weight of such a short life? By the way the house felt when he slept in one corner and the rest of the world seemed to move around that presence? By the daily ledger of needs and delights? By the way plans were sketched around a child who was already asking for a life? He made the family practice tenderness. He taught them patience in real time and required their present attention as the only adequate payment. The small world that held Christopher was not perfect. Friction and fatigue lived alongside tenderness. Arguments flared, bills needed paying, and the practicalities of making a home pressed against the soft center that was his. But there was a purpose to the household's motion, an insistence that the child, so young, so insistent, be kept close and seen. Those ordinary rhythms, the cumulative tenderness of dozens of tiny acts, formed the true shape of his life. But this small world did not exist in isolation.
On the eastern edge of the Rocky Mountains, Colorado Springs in the summer of 1986 looked like a postcard of American suburbia. Rows of modest homes sat neatly against streets where children rode their bikes until dusk, and neighbors waved from trimmed lawns. It was the kind of place where families left their doors unlocked, not out of carelessness, but out of trust. Crime felt like something that belonged to other cities, not here, not in these quiet blocks where evenings passed in peace. That July brought the kind of warmth that lingered even after the sun slipped behind the mountains. The air hummed with the sound of crickets, and a soft breeze drifted through open windows, carrying with it the faint smell of cut grass and summer earth. Street lights flickered on one by one, casting a pale amber glow over the sidewalks. Inside homes, parents tucked their children into bed, believing that the night would unfold as uneventfully as all the ones before it. The Cohn family lived within this world of supposed safety. Their neighborhood was ordinary, unremarkable even, which is what made it feel so secure. People knew each other's names, shared casseroles, borrowed tools. In the stillness of that summer night, there was no hint of danger, no shadow on the horizon. It was the kind of environment where the sound of a screen door creaking open might draw a glance, but never suspicion. And yet, beneath this calm, fate was moving quietly. In the very environment meant to cradle and protect, something unthinkable was about to happen. For all its safety, all its familiarity, this suburban backdrop would soon hold a secret too dark to reconcile with its gentle appearance. Because sometimes it's in the most ordinary places, under the softest summer skies, where the most extraordinary nightmares begin. And in one Colorado home that July night, the silence would be broken by an absence that could never be explained.
Just after midnight on July 15, 1986, the Cohn household in Colorado Springs was quiet. Christopher, only 7 months old, had been laid gently in his crib, wrapped in the security of soft blankets, his tiny breath steady in the dim glow of the nightlight. For his family, it was an ordinary act at the end of an ordinary day. No one could have imagined it would be the last moment of peace they would ever know. The hours slipped by unnoticed. The summer night pressed against the walls of the house, silent except for the rustle of the wind and the distant chorus of crickets. Yet inside, something was shifting. While the family slept, the boundary between safety and horror was crossed. By morning, the world they trusted would collapse. At dawn, the stillness inside the home revealed the devastating truth. The crib where Christopher had been placed was empty. His blanket lay folded back, untouched, as though he had simply evaporated into thin air. The garage door opener was missing, a small detail that spoke louder than words. The basement window stood open. The front door, left unlocked, hung as a silent witness. There were no shattered locks, no overturned furniture, no cries in the night. Nothing to suggest a struggle. Nothing to explain how a child could vanish without waking a single soul in the house. It was as though someone had moved with surgical precision, slipping in and out, leaving behind only silence. And that silence was the most haunting clue of all. A baby does not vanish quietly. An abduction leaves echoes, disturbances, trails. Yet here there was nothing, only absence. It was as if Christopher had been lifted from existence itself, carried away into the dark without resistance. In those first moments of discovery, disbelief turned quickly to dread. What could possibly account for a disappearance so clean, so impossible? Did someone enter under the cover of night, moving stealthily through the rooms of a family home? Or was the danger never outside at all? Was it already inside those walls? The questions that emerged that morning would never be answered, but they would grow heavier with every passing hour. And as the minutes turned to panic, and the panic turned to a desperate search, a grim reality began to unfold. This was not a simple case of a missing child. This was something far darker. and it was only the beginning. By 6:30 that morning, the fragile order of the Cohn household had shattered. Panic poured through every room like a flood, and the call to police was made with a voice raw from fear. Within minutes, uniformed officers arrived, their presence adding both relief and terror, because their arrival confirmed the unthinkable. This was no mistake, no misunderstanding. A baby was gone. The scene inside the house was frantic, almost surreal. Parents scrambling for answers, hands trembling as they pointed to the crib that now sat bare. Officers moved quickly, but their eyes betrayed the same disbelief. A child taken from his own bed without a sound. It felt impossible, even as the evidence stood in front of them. The missing garage door opener, the open window, the unlocked front door. Every detail whispered intrusion, yet none shouted explanation. Word spread with startling speed. Neighbors gathered in clusters along the sidewalks, their faces pale in the morning sun. They whispered in low voices, some clutching their own children tighter, others peering at the house with a mixture of horror and pity. In a neighborhood where people left doors unlocked, the realization struck hard. If it could happen here, it could happen to anyone. Fear seeped into every household, breaking the illusion of safety that had once defined this community. As the hours turned to days, the search intensified. Officers combed the area with flashlights and dogs, moving through streets, yards, and fields. Volunteers joined in, strangers stepping forward to search for a child they would never forget. Flyers were printed, photographs of Christopher's innocent face plastered across telephone poles and grocery store windows. The image of his soft blonde hair and wide blue eyes became a haunting symbol for a community on edge. Then came the most dramatic effort of all. 3 weeks after his disappearance, authorities made the desperate decision to drain Quail Lake, a place not far from the family home. The sight was unforgettable. Massive pumps roaring, pulling back the water, exposing mud and stone that had long been hidden. Crowds gathered at the edges, holding their breath, waiting for the worst to surface. Mothers wept quietly, fathers shook their heads, children clung to arms and legs, all united by dread. Hour by hour, the lake gave up its water. The tension was unbearable, each receding inch a drumbeat of anticipation. And then, nothing. No answers, no body, only more emptiness. What was meant to bring closure delivered only deeper despair. The silence that followed was heavier than before. A baby had been stolen, a lake had been emptied, and still the mystery remained untouched. The community, once trusting and unguarded, now lived in the shadow of a single question. How could something so monstrous happen in their midst without a trace? It was in that silence, thick with fear and unanswered questions, that the investigation would take its next uncertain steps.
From the very beginning, the investigation turned inward. Detectives, faced with a mystery that offered no clear intruder, looked first to the people inside the home. Christopher's parents were in the middle of a fragile reconciliation. They had been separated, navigating tension and uncertainty, and this night, the night their son vanished, was the father's first night back under the same roof. To investigators, coincidence rarely felt innocent. They pressed the family with questions, dissected their stories, and searched for cracks that might explain the unexplainable. The mother, already shaken beyond comprehension, was asked to take a polygraph. Twice, the results pointed to deception. It was a devastating moment, but one clouded by a critical detail. She was in withdrawal from prescribed tranquilizers at the time, a condition known to skew the results. Still, the suspicion was born, and it never left. The parents could not be cleared, not then and not in the years that followed. That shadow clung to them like a permanent mark, a burden heavier than grief alone. But suspicion did not end at the family's doorstep. Detectives uncovered a name: Emma Bradshaw. She was more than just a neighbor or an acquaintance. She was the father's mistress during the separation, a woman with intimate knowledge of the family's lives, a woman rumored to have a history of breaking into homes. She denied any involvement, but her presence in the story cast a long, unsettling shadow. Was her motive jealousy, revenge, or was she nothing more than a convenient suspect in a case starving for answers? As if the disappearance itself weren't chilling enough, the family had endured months of mysterious hang-up calls leading up to that summer night. The phone would ring, the receiver lifted, but only silence waited on the other end. Call after call, night after night, until the line between paranoia and reality began to blur. And then, on the very morning Christopher vanished, the calls stopped. For a brief, eerie silence, the house was free of that haunting intrusion, but months later, they began again, as suddenly as they had ceased, a cruel echo of the nightmare that refused to end. What were those calls? Were they a predator stalking the family, testing boundaries, savoring control before striking? Or were they something even darker? Taunts from the person who already knew where Christopher had gone, reminding the family of their helplessness. The investigation, meant to provide clarity, only layered the story with contradictions and doubts. Every theory pointed in a different direction, yet none could be proven. And so the case, rather than narrowing, widened into a labyrinth of suspicion, whispers, and shadows. It was in this fog of uncertainty, with no clear path forward, that the years would begin to stretch long and merciless.
As the years stretched on, silence became its own kind of torment. The summer of 1986 turned into autumn, autumn into winter, and soon anniversaries began to accumulate like shadows. Each July, the family marked the day Christopher vanished, not with closure, but with aching reminders of what had been stolen. By the 1990s, while the world moved forward, his family remained tethered to that single night, caught in an unending loop of grief, suspicion, and unanswered questions. His siblings grew into adulthood with an absence always at their side. Their childhood photographs carried an empty space, a missing face that should have been among them. They celebrated birthdays and holidays beneath the weight of an invisible presence, each candle on the cake reminding them of a brother who should have been blowing them out too. Christmas mornings brought the same cruel ritual: presents opened, laughter shared, but always followed by the hollow silence of a missing voice. Time did not dull the pain. It only deepened it, etching it into the rhythms of everyday life. His parents endured a different torment. They lived not only with the agony of a vanished child, but also under the cloud of suspicion that never truly lifted. Whispers in the community, knowing looks, the quiet but unrelenting shadow of judgment. They fought to reconcile their grief with the cruel reality that in the eyes of some, they were not victims, but suspects. How does a family heal when every step forward feels shackled by doubt? Yet they refused to surrender Christopher to the past. They built a website, a digital shrine that grew into a lifeline. It became a place where strangers could learn his story, where information could be shared, where hope could live, even when the years tried to suffocate it. They clung to the belief that he was alive somewhere, perhaps raised by people who didn't even know the child in their arms had been stolen. For them, acknowledging death was not an option. But while the family fought to preserve hope, the investigation crumbled. Over time, the Colorado Springs Police Department made choices that left scars just as permanent as the disappearance itself. Vital evidence,
the kind that might one day have been revisited with new technology, was destroyed. Files, belongings, pieces of the puzzle, gone. The family's pain turned to outrage, their trust in the system stripped away. To them, it was not just negligence, it was betrayal, a failure that left them to carry the weight of justice alone. Through the 2000s, anniversaries continued to come and go, each one heavier than the last. Decades passed without answers, without justice, without Christopher. The case settled into the cold, but for his family, it never froze over. It burned quietly, relentlessly, in the empty chair at the dinner table, in the untouched baby items that once promised a future, and in the gnawing truth that the world had allowed his story to fade. And yet, even as the case slipped further into the realm of the forgotten, a spark of hope still lingered, fragile but unbroken, waiting for the moment when the silence might finally be shattered.
The so-called breakthrough did not arrive in the form of hidden evidence, long-forgotten witnesses, or a sudden confession. It came in the form of silence, of absence, of something far more chilling than a dead end. When the family pressed for answers, they learned that much of the very evidence that might have offered truth had been destroyed. Files misplaced, physical samples discarded, chain of custody broken beyond repair. In the sterile language of bureaucracy, it was written off as routine procedure, a matter of space or oversight. But to the family, it felt like an erasure, a deliberate unraveling of the thread that could have guided them back to Christopher. Imagine carrying decades of grief only to discover that the very institutions you relied upon had severed your last lifeline. For the parents, this revelation was not simply a setback, it was a wound, raw and gaping, that told them justice might never walk through official doors. The police, whether through incompetence or indifference, had denied them the dignity of even the possibility of closure. In that moment, the case shifted. The family ceased to be passive petitioners and became investigators themselves, carrying the unbearable burden of pursuing answers in a world where the trail had been deliberately allowed to fade. Yet, heartbreak has a way of hardening into defiance. Christopher's siblings, now adults shaped by years of uncertainty, channeled their grief into action. His sister, driven by conviction and years of suspicion, made a bold and public accusation in 2015, naming Emma Bradshaw as the one responsible for Christopher's disappearance. It was a desperate attempt to force the truth into the open, to shake loose something that might have remained hidden behind closed lips. But the legal system does not move on conviction alone. Bradshaw, denying the accusation, responded not with answers, but with a lawsuit. The courtroom became its own kind of battleground, not about Christopher's fate, but about defamation and reputation. When the judgment came down, it was not against a suspect, but against the grieving sister. She was ordered to pay Bradshaw $150,000, a staggering sum for a family already carrying emotional debts that could never be repaid. For the family, the outcome was devastating. Instead of bringing them closer to the truth, their search had led to another punishment, another scar, another reminder that the world does not always bend toward justice. The fight that was supposed to shed light ended in shadow, leaving them poorer, more isolated, and still without the one answer they had been chasing for decades. And yet, even in the weight of that defeat, one thing remained unchanged: their refusal to let Christopher's memory be reduced to a cautionary tale or a courtroom dispute. In their eyes, he was still out there, a boy who had been taken, a brother whose story had not yet been fully told. It was this determination, battered though it was, that carried the case into its next chapter, where hope and desperation would once again collide.
Sometimes, the most haunting part of a case is not the sudden crack of handcuffs closing or the flash of a mugshot on the evening news. Sometimes, the silence itself becomes the twist. In Christopher's disappearance, there was no arrest, no courtroom reckoning, no moment where a suspect was led away under the weight of proof. Instead, the years unraveled with suspicion lingering like smoke, heavy, suffocating, and impossible to clear. Those closest to the family, the very people who should have been bound together in grief, found themselves standing under clods of doubt. Friends whispered, neighbors speculated, and within the community, a quiet tension took hold. If a child could vanish so completely, and no one could be held accountable, then what did that say about safety, about trust, about justice itself? For the parents, this absence of resolution became its own form of torment. To live without answers is to live in two worlds at once. One where hope clings to the possibility of survival, and another where tragedy has already struck. Each anniversary, each birthday, each passing year deepened the paradox. Their son was both everywhere and nowhere, present in every thought, yet missing from every photograph. The siblings, too, bore the weight differently. They grew into adulthood under the shadow of a brother who never had the chance to grow with them. And as suspicion circled people they had once trusted, they were forced to reckon with a cruel possibility that the truth might not lie in some distant stranger, but closer, unbearably closer, to home. But without evidence, there could be no justice. The files had been thinned, the leads exhausted, and the window for answers seemed to close a little more each year. What remained was the fog, uncertainty that bound the family as tightly as grief ever could. And this is where the twist reveals itself. Because sometimes the shock does not come in unmasking the perpetrator, but in realizing that the unmasking may never happen. The real twist is in the permanence of the unknown, the acceptance that the truth may be buried not by malice alone, but by time, neglect, and silence. It is in this unresolved space that Christopher's story lingers, not as a solved puzzle, but as a wound that refuses to close. And it is from within this darkness that the narrative edges forward into the question of what legacy remains when justice itself is denied.
In the story of Christopher's disappearance, the word trial carries a hollow weight. For decades, the family had dreamed of that single moment when truth would be tested under oath, when evidence would be laid bare, and when justice might finally step into the light. But that day never came. There was no criminal trial, no jury assembled to weigh guilt or innocence, no judge to deliver closure. What the family received instead was a different kind of courtroom battle, one that twisted their grief into bitterness and pitted them against a figure long shadowed by suspicion. In 2015, the family's pain erupted into the public sphere. Christopher's sister, worn down by years of silence and the endless cycle of whispers, stepped forward with an accusation against Emma Bradshaw, the woman whose name had hovered on the edges of suspicion for decades. It was not an accusation in a police file or a courtroom sworn testimony of criminal guilt, but a raw, desperate attempt to give voice to the unspoken suspicions that had stalked the family for years. And in response, Emma did not retreat into silence. She sued. The civil trial unfolded not as a quest for justice for a missing child, but as a battle of reputation, of defamation, of money. Inside the courtroom, the tragedy of Christopher's disappearance was reframed into a bitter feud, one that exposed the fractures time had already carved deep into the family's story. The sister who wanted answers found herself on the defensive. And in the end, it was Emma Bradshaw who walked away with a judgment in her favor, a $150,000 reward, a legal victory that underscored not truth, but power. For the family, it was a devastating moment. Not only had they endured decades without answers, but now, in the one place where they had hoped the system might finally acknowledge their pain, they found themselves silenced once more. There was no verdict about Christopher, no acknowledgement of the unanswered questions that had consumed their lives. Instead, the court closed its doors on them, leaving only a judgment that compounded their grief with humiliation. For the community, the spectacle of that courtroom was a reminder of everything that had been lost, not just a child, but trust in the institutions meant to protect him. People had once whispered that a day of reckoning would come, that eventually the truth would be dragged into the light. But as the years turned into decades and the case decayed into lawsuits and accusations, faith in justice itself seemed to erode. What lingered was not resolution, but disillusionment. Because in the end, the trial they longed for never came. The gavel never fell on the truth. Judgment never arrived, and what remained was absence, a silence louder than any verdict could ever be. But even in the silence, the story did not end. It lingered, demanding to be carried forward into the uncertain shadows of what came next.
In the years that followed, the disappearance of Christopher Abeyta never faded into the background of history. It lingered, a wound that refused to close, carried not just by his family, but by an entire community that had once believed such horrors couldn't touch their quiet streets. For the Abeytas, the passage of time was never a balm. It was a reminder. Every birthday came without candles, every Christmas without one more stocking, every family photograph with a space that could never be filled. And yet, they never surrendered to silence. Where official records had failed them, they built their own archive of memory. A website, painstakingly updated, became both a plea and a memorial, a digital vigil that kept Christopher's face alive in a world that had moved on. Flyers, awareness campaigns, community vigils, these were the memorials they erected, not in stone, but in hope. Their fight was not just against time, but against forgetting. Even as decades passed, the family clung to a fragile but unshakable belief that Christopher might still be alive. Perhaps he had grown into adulthood unaware of the truth of his origins. Perhaps he was living under another name, carrying a history stolen from him before he could even form words. For his parents and siblings, that possibility was both agony and salvation, a thread that kept them moving forward when despair threatened to consume them. But the shadow of failure was never far behind. The destroyed evidence, the discarded leads, the unanswered phone calls, all stood as grim reminders of how easily justice can be lost when systems falter. The Abeyta case became a symbol of what happens when trust in institutions collapses. It was not only the loss of a child, but the loss of faith in the very structures designed to protect him. And for the wider community, it was a scar, a reminder that beneath the illusion of safety, tragedy can strike without warning, and sometimes the answers are buried forever. Still, the family's endurance carved its own legacy. They refused to let Christopher become another statistic, another face in the long, cold corridors of the missing. Their determination was their tribute, their love transformed into action, because for them, giving up was never an option. Some cases remain frozen in time, holding us hostage to questions with no answers.
Somewhere out there, Christopher Abeyta may be living a life he never chose, unaware of the family that still waits for him. Until the truth is found, his story remains one of Colorado's most haunting mysteries. If you believe these stories must be told, subscribe and help keep the memory of the missing alive.